Hey guys, my name is Mannequin and welcome back to Mastering EDM with FL Studios. So before we get too far in today's episode, I want to address a little mistake I made. And it's actually a little mistake, fortunately not a big one. And it's not something about explaining either. What I managed to do was I somehow managed to set this to limiter first and then compressor. Now, if you remember when I talked about the overview, I recall mentioning that I usually have this set to compressor first and then limiter. So somehow I managed to not double check that or accidentally set it to the wrong one, and we had limiter first and then compressor. Now, one of the things I want to show you really quick is if we go to an area with hi-hats. I think this one has some, and we're gonna switch between these two and take a listen to the kick drum and where it sits in the mix as we switch between these two. So what happens here is you probably noticed when we switch this to compressor first and then limiter, what we do is we lose a lot of the kick. And that's not a good thing at all. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't use that? No, what it actually means is we have done this compressing and limiting with this particular order in mind. So if I just switch this to the other one, it's not going to be sounding correct. So so what I had to do, unfortunately, was I actually had to go through and completely remaster this with the compressor and the peak limiter. And you'll notice now this time I have it compressor first and then limiter. And let me make sure this is in the right order. Okay, so that's limiter and then compressor. So these are two different orders here, but listen to the two of them. I'm going to A-B between them, and you'll probably notice that there's not that much of a difference between them now. So they sound pretty similar, and that's because essentially up till now, everything that I've done can basically be done in either order, and it just kind of, you know, it tunes it slightly differently. So so I have this new limiter number 6 that we're going to be using, and the reason is because we need it for the clipper, because the clipper has some certain modes that are only accessible when you have it compressor first and then limiter. If you have it limiter first, some of the modes of the clipper are not accessible. So, but first, we're going to talk about the high frequency limiter. So where is the high frequency limiter applicable in our particular track, and where would you actually use it? So the reason I jumped to a spot with hi-hats is because, first of all, it kind of helps show the difference between the compressor and the limiter modes here. And the other thing is the high frequency limiter is pretty much only going to affect the hi-hats in our track. So if you take a listen here, I'm going to turn on the high frequency limiter and slowly bring the threshold down, and then I'm going to flip back and forth between the two options here, on and off, and we're going to take a listen and see the difference that it makes in the hi-hats. So you could really hear there the difference between on and off with our hi-hats. It really pushes the hi-hats pretty far back in the mix. So the question is, how much are we going to use this high frequency limiter in our particular track? And this is where I say we're not going to use it at all. The reason is because there's nothing in the high end that is really bugging us. This high frequency limiter is basically designed to be something that gets rid of stuff in the high end that we really don't need. And in this particular track, it's been mixed the way that we want to keep the high end. So now an example where you might want to use a high frequency limiter is if you're doing an acoustic track, for example. Let's say you have it's got piano, guitar, and then there's one spot where like some drums come in, and you have like these acoustic drums that you recorded, and you're adding a lot of hi-hats and crashes, and they seem to be too cutting compared to the guitar and the piano. That is a case where you'll want to have the high frequency limiter on, because what happens is it won't affect the piano and guitar so much, but when those drums come in, it'll really start to it'll start to cut down on some of the cutting high end components of the hi-hats and the crashes and things like that, and maybe even the snare. So so really that's what this high frequency limiter is for. It's for basically rolling off the high end when you want to keep the high end. So pushing some of that really crazy stuff in the high end down, so it's not quite as upfront. And really, you know, as I said, this track doesn't have any of that. We want to keep all of our high end, and we really like how it is. So we're not going to turn this on at all. So now for the fun part, the clipper. And the clipper is where we're going to spend most of our time in this particular video today, as you can probably tell since we barely touched on the high frequency limiter. But the clipper has a lot of different combinations you could set it to. As you could tell with this one, it has an interesting factor in the fact that this one has off, mid-side, and normal. This one has off, blah, blah, blah. And this one actually has a dedicated on-off switch and then different modes. And then we actually have upsampling options as well. So we're going to go through and we're going to try to set this to something that sounds nice. But keep in mind, we're not going to go through all the combinations here. The reason is because the multiband, mid-side, normal modes, those are enough in and of themselves. But when we start to adjust the upsampling modes, in addition to this little button up here, we can have a lot of potential options. And I'm just not going to be able to exhaust all of those in this particular video. So, I'm going to briefly touch on some of them, and you'll probably find that you won't be messing around with the clipper too much. So, okay, so without further ado, let's get into this. I'm going to find, we'll go here. This is a good spot to actually check out the clipping. So the clipper here, we're going to turn this on, and I have this set to a decent amount. I'm going to turn down the threshold more after I turn it on, and take a listen to how much it distorts it. Would have helped for me to turn it on there. So you can tell that the distortion gets pretty harsh. Now the question is, since we've been avoiding distortion so much in our mastering process so far, why are we bringing it in now? And the answer to that is the clipper here is kind of warmer than the other distortions. It's designed to kind of spread out the harmonics of your song. So if we have our EQ here and we visualize this stuff here, you see that we have stuff all the way across the spectrum. And what this kind of does is it spreads some things in the low end to the mids, and it spreads some things at the high end to the mids, and stuff from the mids into the low end, and stuff from the mids into the high end. So basically what it does is it kind of smears across our sound a little bit to blend everything together. It's like if you have a photo with a bunch of very contrasting colors, and they're very vibrant and vivid, and it kind of looks like you chop stuff into it, and the photo doesn't look very uniform. One of the things you could do is you could add a filter over the photo, and that filter affects all the different colors, and it kind of just blends them together a bit by adding a bit of tone to all of them. So that's kind of one of the things we're doing with the clipper here. We're basically getting our entire sound here and kind of smearing it all together so it just sounds a bit more unified, and we don't get so much we don't get the sort of sound like different parts have been chopped in and they don't really fit and they're kind of out of context. So that's the design of the clipper here. And we're gonna, in our particular case, you know, you could push this a bit further if you were doing hard style or various other genres that are kind of more pushing the track in terms of loudness, like electro. This, since we're not doing electro, this is a trance track. We're gonna be focusing a little bit more on kind of warming up the track a bit, giving it a bit of crunch, but not enough to where it sounds like it's distorting. So that's going to be the fun part here. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is we have this knee here. And the knee is kind of like a secondary threshold. And its behavior also gets changed depending on what mode we have here. So once again, you could tell this is going to be a very complex unit here. So what we're going to try to do is I'm going to keep this on the lowest knee because this is kind of like the softest form of clipping here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust it here, and then we're going to pull up the knee a little bit to bring it in just a little bit better. Okay, so that sounds like we're pushing it a little bit. So what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to flip through the modes right now. And that'll give us an opportunity to listen to multiband and normal and see how they affect the sound and if we want to choose one of those. Now, once again, we already know what normal, mid-side, and multiband are, so I'm not going to explain those. We're just going to choose the one that we think fits best. And you could tell there already that multiband is giving us a lot better response in terms of the clipper here. It's not distorting quite as fast, and it'll give us more room to kind of squash things a little bit inside this clipper. So that's about where we're going to sit this clipper, and now I'll mess with the knee here and we can get a chance to listen to that. Okay, so we'll stick it there for now, and now what we're going to do is we're going to check this particular area, because once again, this is the quietest area of our track, and we need to make sure that it doesn't distort as we're playing this area through. Now, you'll see there will probably be some artifacts that'll pop up, and we'll try to work with the knee to adjust those. We might need to just increase the threshold here so that it's not clipping as quite as much, though. So one of the things to notice here is right after this impact, if I zoom into this, there's this section right around here that starts to peak up and cause some clipping. Oops, that was not what I wanted. Try this again. Right here. Right around here. See right there? And a little bit right there. So that's kind of what we're keeping an ear out for right now. So I'm going to mess with the knee a little bit more, and then we'll jump back to this section because this is a very powerful section, and get those so we could have it kind of working best between the both of those. I think we're pretty much safe in this sort of area over here. And so we're going to go check this area once again and dial it in just a little bit more. And I think that's fine, and we'll keep it there. Okay, so the next line of order is messing with the upsampling. Now, the upsampling is going to be fun here because once again we have this little thing up here, and this is going to be a lot of what we're going to have to set here. So basically this 1x 4x here just kind of chooses the mode to interpolate the sound. And why do we do this? This is a very good question here, and the reason is because you'll notice as we play this back, it's just like this one single waveform. And when a speaker tries to reproduce it, this is basically what it's doing. We have the midline here, and this is pushing it up, and that's pulling it back. Or pushing it forward and pulling it back. So that's kind of what it's doing here. And you'll notice there's some very fast peaks here, like right here, that you kind of question whether or not it's possible for your speaker to move that fast. And while this is not a 100% technically accurate description, it's the basic idea of what happens here. When we have this in digital, it makes sense one way, but when we have it go to analog, which means when it goes out from our computer into the real world, there are going to be some differences. This 4x here, what it does is it accounts for those differences and clips and also limits with those in consideration. And what that means is this kind of smooths out your sound a bit more, and it just adjusts it so it plays back a bit more transparently. Now, in our particular case, I would venture to say 1x is probably the option if you end up going with upsampling. Right now, upsampling is off. So what I'm going to move to now is this is gain reduction, and this is signal. So we have two options here. Gain reduction is basically like, it's kind of like a dry wet mix, sort of. That's kind of the principle behind it. It mixes the threshold and the knee and the signal, and kind of like when it's not clipping, it kind of just passes the original signal, and when it is clipping, it does a upsampled version or something like that. I don't remember exactly how it works, but the idea here is it's kind of like a dry wet mix in this particular option. And then signal just runs the full signal through the upsampler, and it behaves in that regard throughout the entire clipper. Now if we set this to off, it does go through the clipper, but it does not get upsampled in the same way. So I believe you still can upsample here, but yes, you can. So you can upsample here, because the option is still available, but it's not going to be running through the clipper in the same way. So it's kind of just like, do we upsample for the clipper, or do we upsample for other things? So now I'll just move over to this section with the hi-hats, and we'll see if we could hear a difference between 1x and 4x with the upsampling off, but I doubt we'll hear that much. And the difference is hardly audible to me. So there's not much that I'd suggest for this one otherwise, other than just leave it off if you don't know what it's doing. So because unnecessary processing is unnecessary. I mean, that's kind of a tautology there, but it is worth putting out there. Don't just set it to 4 times because you're like, oh, 4 times sampling, that's better. Well, it can be, but if you don't hear it and you don't know what it's doing, just leave it off. It helps as much of your original sound to pass through as possible. Okay, so now we're going to go to this mode, which I believe normally, I don't remember exactly how it works, but the clipper, typically when it's in GR mode, which is gain reduction mode, this shouldn't matter. I believe it actually does not do 4x oversampling whenever you have it set to this mode. And then signal, it does matter. So so we're going to see how it sounds with off and signal. So I'm just going to set it to signal first. I'm going to have that set to 4 times. And we're going to try to listen to this and bounce back to off. So you can tell what that does is one of the things it affects is the bass and the kick, and it kind of smooths it out a little bit and warms it up. Now, I'm just going to leave this off because I don't like that. But now we'll switch over to gain reduction mode, and then we'll move to signal and then off. So it's just 2 different tones there. They're very subtle. This one kind of sounds rounder, and this one kind of sounds softer. So that's kind of what the vibe I'm getting from this. And I believe the difference will also be a little bit more present in this area. So play this back. Yeah, it doesn't really do that much. So we're not going to mess with the upsampling. We're just going to leave it off for now. Partially because I'm not 100% certain how much it is affecting the sound in relation to these settings here. So if I change the settings to different things, it may become more present. But for our purposes, we don't really need this so much because once again, this sort of stuff is more suited for acoustic things. Just like the high frequency threshold here we were talking about, if we have like an acoustic and piano section and we want like some drums that come in, we don't want the hi-hats to be quite so cutting, then we're going to turn down the high frequency threshold on those hats so that they don't sound like they're like, you know, cutting over top of the acoustic piano and guitar that should sound, you know, they should be most of the sound. So so it's kind of the same idea here with the oversampling. We're just trying to focus on this one's supposed to focus on making it sound natural, but quite frankly, EDM isn't natural. So we're just going to leave that off. We're going to leave the upsampling off, and then we'll just work with what we have right now. So the gain, threshold, knee, and mode have been set for what we like. So pretty much all that's left is the protection. Now, how long have I been running? I've been running 20 minutes. So we're going to wrap up today's video at that, and we'll talk about the protection last. And there's not going to be too much to talk about for protection just because it is only 3 settings here. But they do kind of tie into the clipper a bit. So look out for that. And in the meantime, have fun with the clipper. Sometimes I use it when mastering. Sometimes I don't. That's one of the things I do want to mention. I pretty much always use a compressor and a peak limiter, but I don't always use the clipper. It really depends on the track and what sort of tone I'm looking for. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.